Okay. We should be live on all of our platforms now. So, hello, everyone who is starting to join us. We are back again today with another masterclass with Dr. Irina-Maria on Runic Magic, Part 3. This is probably our last edition of this series, although we might talk about similar things again, I would assume. Okay, as usual, just quickly, what is SASA? SASA stands for Save Ancient Studies Alliance. It's our mission to promote the study of the ancient world and engagement with our human deeper past, building a grassroots movement throughout outreach, collaboration, accessibility, and public scholarship. We work towards our goal of inspiring a wide, inclusive community of scholars, learners, and students. So we do this in lots of ways, like these master classes that we're hosting, and we have some fun stuff coming up in October too, which we'll announce soon on social media. And of course, we have our searchable access database, our Archeo Gaming education modules for teachers, and Archeo Gaming live streams, and a million more things that we work on. So please check us out. You can find us by searching Save Ancient Studies Alliance on pretty much any platform. Please make sure you follow and subscribe and engage with our content. That really helps a lot. These kinds of live streams go out on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and Twitch, and sometimes Instagram as well. And they're all saved there. They stream Archeo Gaming live on Twitch on Fridays. So protocol for the event, please be kind and respectful. Listen and ask thoughtful questions throughout the event. We do really want to hear from you in the chat and hear about any questions or comments you have on the stuff that we're talking about today. We really love engaging with you guys. The live events are, like I said, recorded and saved on the platforms they are streamed on, so you can find them later as well. And last but not least, if you like what you see from SASA, please consider becoming a recurring donor. We are a small NGO that is basically run on grants and stuff. So every little bit helps. You can become a recurring donor for as little as $3 a month and go to saveancientstudies.org/donate to learn more. And thank you for joining us. I will hand it over to Irina, Irina, thank you for joining us again.
Yeah, thank you so much. Likewise. Thrilled to be here for the third installment. Right, I think it's working. Yeah, cool.
Yeah. I'm going to turn off that little QR code in the corner so it's not like blocking stuff for you, but take it away. Thank you, Irina.
Yeah, okay, thanks a lot. Right, so today the third installment on the series, or the third episode on the series Runic Magic, Historical Runic Magic. If you haven't seen the first two installments, I highly recommend that you do so, because the topics are a little different. So I've spoken about healing charms, for example, so far, and empowerment charms, also some erotic magic. So you're going to find all that in the previous installments. This installment is going to be rather about curses that we can find on rune stones and on some amulets. And I will end the series with a couple of interesting poems and different mentions of runes and runic curses in later sources in the Old Norse poetry, as well as in some Old Norse sagas. So we do have some very interesting examples of runestones, the runic alphabet being used in order to curse someone as well. Unfortunately, many of these examples are not really that clear. There are the longer curses, which can be interpreted in multiple ways, and this has a lot to do with the way runes are written, because they can be written left to right, as well as right to left, so the bustrophodon, and then on vertical, and then on horizontal. So sometimes it also has to do with the word order in which you want to interpret the runes. Nevertheless, generally speaking, most of these runes, runic charms that deal with curses, have to do with either preventing someone from entering a grave, or some kind of protective spell, as well as preventing the dead from leaving the grave. Speaking of our October bash, this is also a very interesting topic in Old Norse sources. Apparently, both in the Viking Age and under Christian influence, there was this idea of the dead being capable of coming back to the world of the living, and this wasn't always that pleasant. So people rather wanted to avoid that. So this is another context where we can find runic magic. Let's have a look at a couple of examples. So first of all, we have probably the largest inscription from the area of Denmark. That is the Eggia stone. Sorry, from the area of Norway. That is the Eggia stone. And this is a very interesting stone because it is written in the so-called transitional futhark. So futhark means alphabet in Old Norse, and this is essentially based on the first letters. Like we have alphabet, the futhark is also based on the first letters. And this is a very interesting stone because it contains both elements from the older futhark, so the one used from about 100 200 AD, as well as from the later futhark, the one in which the Viking Age inscriptions were written. So this example of a stone has a menacing or magical legend on it. It's not really that easy to decipher what was written here, but there is some consensus regarding the general message of the stone. It has been interpreted and reinterpreted since the 60s, and generally speaking, there are two possible ways of interpreting it. I'm going to show you in a jiffy. But first of all, we're dealing with some kind of ritual of passage related to the afterlife, and perhaps Odin is also mentioned here. That's a bit unclear. And there is also a riddle, and the riddle has to do with some kind of fish spirit or Odin in the shape of a fish. Anyway, a very obscure reference because we don't really find Odin in any kind of connection to fish in later sources. He was rather connected to birds and wolves, and particularly ravens, and so on. But we do have the term bird as well on this stone. So it may have to do with this idea of shape shifting as some kind of grave magic or ritual of passage. Then the second interpretation is a little more mundane. It might be also a reference to a shipwreck with some people dying, and then again the passage to the afterlife with some sea creatures help. So, like I said, the Eggia runestone is to be found in Norway. It has 1.6 meters and it is flat over a man's grave. So it is what we call a recumbent stone. It's not really a runestone like you know them in the vertical form. There are also some stones which are placed horizontally over a man's grave with the rune inscribed facing downwards. So the whole context of its placement shows us that it was not a text intended for public consumption. So it was not, unlike the more common examples of runestones that were placed in very visible spaces, in a field or on a hill or at a crossroads or so on and so forth. This was not meant to be seen. So this is definitely a case of something more concealed, of a form of magic, grave magic. So let's have a quick look at it. I added here three potential translations. One translation, the one that has to do with the people dying in this shipwreck, you can find in the Rune-data database. It's a large collection of all the inscriptions found so far in Scandinavia and beyond. And the other two, which are very similar, have to do with this Odin connection and some sort of, let's say, negative sympathetic magic, and I will explain in a jiffy what it is about. So I'm going to refer to these two examples actually for the translation. So the stone has not been struck by the sun and it has not been scored by a sax. So this is a reference to the fact that perhaps the stone was created under some very special circumstances. This also suggests some kind of magical context. And the next part is even more interesting because it says, "No man shall lay it bare while the waning moon runs, neither shall a man lay the stone aside." So this would be a case of sympathetic magic or negative sympathetic magic, in the sense that you shall not do this and that to the runestone, as the rune carver didn't do this and that. So it is from the negative perspective. And then it would say, "This thing a man sprinkled with corpsey," that would be a metaphor for blood, "scraped it with the board in the whole worn top rigging." As what did the army Ors come here to the land of the valiant? The army Ors that would be a reference to Odin. Most probably, he was not only the god of war or any kind of military stuff, the god of the elites. He was also god of sorcery and many other things. But he does have this attribute as well. The one presiding over the bravest warriors, and so on. So this would seem to be a riddle. It's very obscure because again we have this reference to the fish swimming out of the foul stream, and then the reference to the bird crowing in a fiendish band. Maybe it is a lost myth related to Odin that we no longer can figure it out what it was. And as for the man sprinkling with blood, well, here there are also two possibilities. You can either take this quite literally, like blood was used in rituals. We know that from other sources as well as from archaeology. It was used in order to sprinkle, for example, the halls where the sacrifices of animals took place. But then again, another interpretation would be that here it is actually meant that he colored it. So the rune carver, after carving the runes, he colored them in red, because according to analysis, these letters were actually colorful at some point. So maybe it is a more mundane reference. So either a ritualistic one or a more mundane one. So the last part, and here you can see the consensus. It has to do something with protection. So the stone needs to be protected. This is something all the interpretations take into account. We also find most probably the term alu written in the last string of letters. And alu actually means dedication. So this is a dedication as a form of protection against the wrongdoer. So anyone attempting to enter this grave with the bad intention of stealing something from it, desecrating it, should be prevented, hindered from doing so by this magic, by this spell. It is an imprecation, in other words, against anyone willing to open the grave, and specifically open the grave at night. Spells against thieves were actually pretty common at the time, and they were also very common in medieval times as well. And we do have even later references again to Odin being the one capable of fending off this danger and protecting the gravestone. So essentially, we're dealing here with protective magic, although the details are not really that clear, but generally speaking, the mythological context would strongly suggest that. And perhaps it is also telling the fact that we have Odin here because Odin, being the master magician, the master sorcerer, he's also the best possible character in order to render this spell more powerful. This reminds of other stones found with similar connotations, such as the stones at Blekinge. This is a group of stones. It's a very interesting group of stones. They're all part of a larger monument, and one of these stones, so in Sweden, is the Stentoften stone. And it's very interesting for us because here you can also find remnants of potential older rituals, which is not really that common to find on rune stones. We should also take into account that most rune stones we find are actually quite mundane, common funerary monuments where someone is dedicating the monument to somebody dead, and there are also some inheritance claims that are being assessed on the stones. Either way, the references to magic are not really that typical, but this is one example, and it's an older one, again from this transitional period. Like I said, part of a larger monument, and with an intermediate version between the elder alphabet, the elder Futhark, and the younger one. So for example, you have the A rune, which has the same form as the H rune of the younger Futhark, and some other examples. And there is this group of stones, the Istebu and Gummap being some of the other ones, and they are in a common context, probably related to the same, let's say, the same family. who raised them. And there are also some names here which are quite typical for chieftains. You can see here Hathulvar and Hariulvar. So this would mean essentially the warrior wolf. So either this was just an appropriate name to give someone to suggest that they were powerful, or it might have something to do with the again ritualistic aspect, in the sense of a potential cult involving shape shifting using the skills of animals. But this is very speculative. We do have reference to that from later sources, but transferring it to older sources is quite problematic, so this remains a little bit speculative. But there is some kind of reference here to a particular ritual, because we have here reference to a full year, so to the fertility. And then it states that the master carver, he concealed here runes of power, so Ginu Runar. This is again something very powerful to write, and it states not necessarily that the letters themselves were powerful, but that the whole inscription is meant to carry this this power and to protect the stone, to protect the monument. And the curse placed here upon those who would dare desecrate it is something called ergi. Ergi, which is both an older and a newer concept, in the sense that you can find it both in pagan and Christian context. And this is, yeah, in the runic database, it was translated as maleficence, but it is something a little more specific than that. It's something about effeminacy or passivity, sexual passivity, which was something sorcerers, magicians were accused of. So that doesn't mean that they didn't continue practice magic, but there is also this social stigma attached to them. So it's essentially a stone that curses those who desecrated with this state of ergi, effeminacy, which was not really something socially desirable. And the curse goes even further, cursing with death those who dare break the stone. And then there is this reference to potential sacrifices having taken place in the area, which are commemorated by the stone, because there are mentions of some animals here which may have been sacrificed, such as the 9 stallions and 9 bucks. And again, the mention of the fruitful year. So this whole general context suggests that we're dealing with some kind of fertility ritual, most probably, and this stone was meant to commemorate that ritual. So perhaps in order to make it more powerful. So it was essential to protect this stone, because by protecting the stone, you would also ensure that this ritual would actually bring something very palpable to the people performing it. So that's also quite interesting. And a similar one is from the same complex. It's the Björkatorp runestone, and it's raised kind of like 10 kilometers away from the others mentioned, but it is beyond doubt that it is somehow connected to them. And apparently we have here a mention of a prophecy of destruction for again those who break this monument. And it's the same, or almost the same formula, with concealing the runes of power, and with cursing the people who would dare do something to this monument, with this very unpleasant condition of being an outcast, of being arger. Let's have a look at a couple of other examples. Again, it's a little bit speculative what I'm going to tell you about the next examples, but it would be very nice if it indeed, if the interpretation were indeed accurate. I'm going to give you an example from the island of Fyn in Denmark at Nøre Nero. And here you can find the following message. Njot kummels Thormundur. Make good use of the monument. Kummel is a very common word that you're going to find on runestones. It just means monument. So there is the simpler explanation that this would be, in a way, something very similar to a rest in peace monument or sentiment in the context of Christianization, you're also going to find on a lot of rune stones the message, may God rest his soul, or may God rest her soul. So perhaps it would be, there would be a connection here. This is the simpler explanation. However, this might also have to do with something a little darker, in the sense that make good use of this monument could have been used in order to command the person in the grave to just like stay there and not come back as a revenant, haunting the living or causing havoc or whatever. Um, so this would be comparable with to other amulets with healing spells, for example, found in Sigtuna in Sweden, where you can find the message "make good use of this healing charm." So it's almost like a warning. So it is a recommendation, but it can also be interpreted like a warning. And in our case, like Thormund, don't dare come back from the graves. Like stay there. So one potential interpretation of such messages would be that of a binding grave spell, and it is not the only example. If we look further on, we're going to find again from Denmark, the Gerlev runestone, tall one, 2.2 meters tall. And here you can find the message that Þjóðverð reististein þenna eftir Óðin kor, njót velkommels, þistil, mistil, kistil, etc. runar ret, Gunni Armundur. Thjóði raised the stone in memory of Odin Kor. And then we have a string of letters, some of the they're the letters of the alphabet. It's a string of the alphabet, the futhark, and this was generally used in order to increase the potency of the spell, or at least that would be the contextual interpretation. And then we have again make very good use of this monument, and then we have something interesting as well, the formula thistle mistletoe casket, which is a very much used formula in all kinds of Old Norse spells. You're also going to find it quite often on runic sticks. So it was really some kind of string of words, again meant to empower, meant to seal the spell. I placed the runes rightly. Gunni Armund, Doug. This thistle mistletoe thing, it's also used in spells related to healing, or to use an older term, leechcraft. So it was definitely something, there's definitely something magical going on here. We can consider it to a certain extent a magical funerary stone, and the whole context would suggest that there was this magic apparently aiming to bind the deceased Odinkor to his grave. So we do have a development of the older amuletic formulism with all these formulas, and then using the string of alphabet and using these words that apparently don't mean anything, the thistle mistletoe charm, and then the people performing this, and so on. So it does appear that it has a magical function, perhaps much more clearly than the other stone we discussed, because this is much better contextualized. All right. Now, let's discuss another very interesting example from Denmark as well. This is the Malt stone. It has a longer inscription. It's also higher. It's 2.5 meters long. And it's a granite slab that would have stood just under 2 meters tall about before he was buried. So this was at a river crossing. Perhaps the location is also interesting. So this was a stone for people to see. And it also features an interesting picture with a man's head with a cross on his forehead, which would be a clear Christian symbol. But the context of the runic inscription might point out to several older pagan elements. So again, this is at least the last two strings of runes are very difficult to figure out. In many sources, they're not really given, or they're given with question marks. Now I'm going to use here a version which is from 2006 to interpret the runestone, although it's broken at the bottom, so it's not really that certain. At any rate, there seems to be a riddle at the beginning, or perhaps, well, I don't know. It's a question either way. Who is the something of the Asir, who is perhaps one of the gods of the Asir who are represented on the stone, or perhaps who are hiding in the stone. We don't really know. And then it continues the very classical way with the name of the sponsor, with the Vefrider who made this in memory of his father, yeah, then the carver who concealed the runes of gladness and runes of eternal friendship. It's also very interesting. And then the inscription is, yeah, very, very unclear, because it appears that some of the letters are ututut, billiginger, and there is also a word turaki, which might have something to do with the previous stones as well. At any rate, it has features that are present in many other inscriptions with magical content. We have names, we have a symbol, we have a row of Futhark letters and some nonsensical palindromes here. And the repetition of the T and the U at the end might have something to do with the loan word from Latin with titul, just meaning inscription, but then again, this is quite speculative. And then the joyful and eternal runes. This is actually a little clearer because we can find similar phrases in some of the other runestones as well as in some Old Norse poetry. So if you look, for example, in the Old Norse poem called the list of Rig, you're going to find Evin runar och ald runar, eternal rules and life runes. The list of Rig is a poem detailing the different social classes in Scandinavia. And if we accept the interpretation of Billiganger as being an intelligible word, this would essentially mean something like denial of walking. So again, perhaps a reference to this old concept of the dead being capable of returning from the grave and interacting with the living. So this is something that you find quite a lot in later sources. You have the idea of the revenant. There are many famous characters in saga literature who are revenants. For example, Glomer in the saga of Grettir, the shepherd wreaking havoc and uttering a very long and well-known curse on the hero Grettir. And then you have Thorolf Lamefoot from the saga of the people of Eiri, who is this very furious and devastating character who cannot rest and who essentially destroys social life in the households he haunts. So it would make sense for such an inscription to actually be here, so denying the dead the return among the living. But like I said, this depends a lot on the reading of the inscription. And then you would have another string of letters that would remind a little bit of the prophecies that were inscribed on the runes at Blekinge. So the idea of a dire counsel related to a baleful prophecy. Right, so the question remains, is this an inscription meant against raising from the dead? Was it preventive? Was it meant to stop the dead people from coming back and wander in the world of the living? It is definitely a very interesting hypothesis, but unfortunately we don't have a very precise answer. So it's well worth thinking about it. Okay, let's continue with more Danish memorial stones, this time from Klaventrop. It's also a very interesting stone. And this stone was placed by someone called Ragnhilder in the memory of a priest, of the priest of a temple or a sanctuary, or yeah, something of the sort. The honorable thing, that would be a word meaning, well, almost like a leader or some kind of chieftain, the leader of the retinue. And then it says that Ali's sons made these monuments in memory of their father, and his wife in memory of her husband. Then we have the name of the carver. Soti carved these runes in memory of his lord. Interestingly, but not a unique case, is the mentioning of Thor. So Thor vigith runar, Thor hallow these runes. It's also interesting that Thor is essentially the only god who comes up on these rune stones in order to hallow them. That doesn't happen with other gods. They might be mentioned in some kind of other context, but it's not to hallow something. So Thor would have definitely been one of the most important god, if not the most important god, that was actually worshipped by not only by the elites, like in Odin's case, but generally speaking, by the general population. Right. So Thor hallow these runes, and then we have the interesting part. He who damages the stone or drags it to stand in memory of another, he should become a warlock. Now, again, this is very interesting. The translation warlock, you shouldn't be thinking particularly about magicians here. You should, again, be thinking about that concept I mentioned before, the arger concept. So, he who damages the stone or uses it to other purposes it was meant for should become this, outcast person from society, so someone who doesn't belong to society, someone who should be condemned by the others. So not literally a warlock. This word reta here is very difficult to interpret. It pops up on one more runestone, but other than that, it's a very tough word to interpret. At any case, you need to contextualize it. So it's definitely, if you look at the whole inscription and if you compare some elements with elements of other stones, you could come to the conclusion that at any rate, this would have been something bad to become. You shouldn't have become that because it was uh, really frowned upon by society. So something like an outcast, if you want a more general term, that would be an outcast. So again, you can interpret this as a grave warding type of curse, like the Ega inscription and many others. And because we have Thor here also invoked, yeah, definitely the protective role was enforced here. Yeah, and speaking of wizards and the Arger, the outcasts. We have further evidence that this was a common type of curse, and the text on one of the stones from Søndervinge in North Jutland, so also in Denmark, concludes that the man who destroys this memorial should be um, not only a wizard, but also, well, how should I put it? It should be sodomized or something like that. So this again definitely has to do with this idea of people engaging in some magical acts, being perceived as very, very liminal figures that were also involved in things that were not really accepted. So the idea that they would have been passive, this probably has to do with the fact that if you performed magic, you had some dealings with some spirits, and those spirits, if you look at some shamanistic practices and compare them to that, they would have also penetrated you in order to give you power. So magicians had this very ambiguous status, both in the Viking Age and post-Viking Age, where they were considered, both gifted and powerful, but at the same time, they were also considered to be perverted in one way or another. So this is one type of curse you can find on these stones. May those who destroy these memorials become wizards, in the sense of people engaging in intolerable acts one way or another. Further examples, this is the Salibu stone, this time from Sweden, and the message is quite similar. So may whoever cuts to pieces or breaks these monuments, may they become a warlock, or a maleficent or misdoing woman is also used here in order to, really enforce this idea of being someone passive, which was quite intolerable in the society at that time. Right. The Seidr can also be mentioned. So the Seidr was the most common type of magic. There is at least one inscription using the term Seidrati. So this would be, essentially a sorcerer. So someone, literally practicing the magic of Seidr, which was not really negatively connotated, but it had this ambiguous status. At any rate, it was not something very pleasant to be called. So this would have definitely been considered a very powerful, curse against robbing graves or something of the sort. And usually you can find these curses on rune stones. However, there are also some interesting objects that are not rune stones, such as this copper scales box from Sigtuna. Again, in Sweden, Sigtuna, because it was a very important commercial center, Sigtuna and Birka before it. So the box was used probably by a merchant to keep a small pair of scales for weighing silver and gold. Actually, similar scales have been found in Birka as well, more than 100 in fact. And it is also engraved with an Old Norse poem. It's actually a poem. It's written in the so-called Drotkvat meter, which is the meter that was used when the court poets, the so-called skalds, used to praise lords and kings. So this is definitely something very interesting. It dates back to the 11th century, and it appears to contain a warning to potential thieves. So it says that Djarv got the scales in the land of whatever from a Somish man, so from someone from the north, and Vermund carved these stones. And then the interesting part, the bird ripped apart the pale robber. One saw how the corpse, cuckoo, that would be the raven, swelled. So there are definitely metaphors, the so-called kenningar, used here, complex metaphors. And it would have been quite an important message because, the person who composed the poem would have put a lot of effort into writing such a poem. It was not really an easy endeavor. So the warning on the Sigtuna box again cautions against the desecration or stealing of memorial objects or memorial stones, and it belongs, like the rune stones, to this category of preventative magic, acted like a deterrent, in other words. It was not the only type we could find. There are also some examples, albeit later examples, of so-called judicial curses or prayers. And the difference would be that these were actually before the act had taken place. So they were not preventative, they were after the thing happened. So this was in the sense that they would have acted upon a thief in order to punish them for a deed that they committed. So this is, for example, an appeal on a long Norwegian stick, again in the same meter in a drotkvat, so the royal meter of poetry. And this is an appeal for the wrath of God to fall upon someone called Svein, who did something wrong, whose misdeed seems to have been to refuse to hand over a treasure trove he had found to his king. So he kept it to himself. Thus, we have the following very overdue in being paid is that which Svein didn't have found. The silver mountain of dwarf pebbles. You can see here the complexity of these metaphors. So this is probably a kenning, a metaphor for a treasure, as a gift to the generous one. The generous one probably being the king. So says the army together with the king. May he who lied to the dear diminisher of the sea's flames, again, a very complex metaphor. So the sea's flames, this would be gold or some kind of treasure, and the one who diminishes the treasure, so the one sharing the treasure with the subjects, would be the king. So the king is meant here again. This punishment I ask for the scoundrel loathsome to the people, to bear God's wrath. So this is a very interesting example of how these elements, both pagan and Christian, blend together in order to create this beautiful judicial curse or prayer. Right. Now, the thing is that many of the rune inscribed amulets were found in graves or burial mounds. However, many of them were probably buried as a possession of the deceased. But others have been thought, like some of the rune stones, to have been deposited in the grave in the hope that the associated corpse remain confined. However, it is we do have this problem on close inspection, how to interpret the amulets, or whether we can really regard them as preventing the ones in the grave from coming back, or perhaps they were just objects that belonged to the deceased, and we are over interpreting them. At any rate, if you compare such curses that we find in runic inscriptions with the better known Greco-Roman curses, the deficciones or the katadesmos, there are some essential differences, because so the Greek and Roman ones, they were these curse tablets, usually rolled and folded, and usually pierced with nails, so binding spells, and the tablets were placed in the graves, or thrown in wells, or in some kind of underground temporal sanctuary, or even nailed to a wall. And the cursed tablets, they were actually addressed to someone very specific, typically to some kind of infernal deity, such as Hecate or Persephone or Pluto, and so on and so forth. And they essentially requested, via the mediation of the dead person, that something happen to someone else. Some texts do not invoke the gods, but merely list the targets of the curse. And there is an essential difference to the runic inscriptions, because they don't really contain that kind of elements. So generally speaking, if we look at the potential curses we have in runic inscriptions, we're going to notice either this possible idea of preventing the dead from coming back, or the most common one, to prevent the monument from being desecrated. But it is not the same complexity, and it is not the same intent as we find in older types of magic, such as Mediterranean magic. So this would also be an important point, something to look out for. Okay, right. So we finished this part with discussing about runic curses, and then the last point I want to make here is about runic lore. So this means essentially references to runes that we find either in so-called Eddic poetry. That would be the collection of mythological and heroic poems from the 1200s from Iceland, or in later sagas. So the stories either of the Icelandic settlers or later sagas about older times from the migration period, for example. Well, the theme is the migration period, but the sagas are actually quite late. So runes are often portrayed as inherently magical in literature. However, this is not really, or at least not always, reflected in the runic inscriptions that have been found, because so far we actually discussed the more special ones, the ones which do appear to have some kind of magical context. However, we do need to take note of the fact that many of these inscriptions were very commonplace, very mundane, ranging from just simple inscriptions on very common objects such as a comb or a sword. So this would be from the older times, from the migration period as well, and going up to the period of the rune stones, which is a very prolific period in the 10th century and the 11th century as well. But many of these rune stones, actually most of these rune stones, have nothing to do with curses. They just record a sponsor, and a sponsor who financed the erection of the runestone in the honor of a dead family member. And sometimes the runestone can also be used in order to clarify the relationship between the sponsor and the person commemorated. What we are doing here, what we have been discussing so far, are the most special uses. So that's also something important to note. But we do have references in at least two important poems from the Poetic Edda to the use of runic magic, not in the sense that the runes had some kind of magical qualities, but that you could empower them by using them with the intent of casting a spell. So we have, for example, the Sigurdrivumol, the Lay of Sigurdriva. Sigurdriva being the correspondent of Brynhildr, probably in the saga of the Volsungs. Essentially, there is this Valkyria who is awakened from a sleep by the hero Sigurd, and she's asleep because she was punished by Odin, and apparently she was punished by Odin because she refused to obey his orders and uh, take claim the life of some warrior on the battlefield. So Sigurd goes to the sleeping Valkyrie and he releases her from the spell and he asks her for advice. And Sigurdriva bestows upon him a lot of gnomic wisdom as well as runic wisdom. And you can find a lot of examples of potential spells that can be used with the help of runes. So by writing victory runes, for example, or ale runes, or helping runes, or speech runes, so on and so forth, you can achieve something quite great. So I'm just going to quote a little bit from this poem directly in the translation. It's a translation of Caroline Larrington from Oxford Words Classics. So, for example, the Valkyria states that she is going to give him victory runes he must cut. If you want to have victory, cut them on your sword hilt. This is also something we have noticed before with the empowerment spells. So like writing a string of runes on your sword might have rendered the sword more powerful. And invoke Tyr twice. This might be a reference to the fact that we do have a rune which is called the Tyr rune, which is the same name as one of the warrior gods in Norse mythology. So it may be a way, again, to empower an object. Then she mentions the ale runes. Ale runes, must you know, if you don't want another's wife to beguile your trust, if you trust her on a horn, they should be cut and on the back of the hand, and mark your nail with nauth. Nauth, which is again the name of a rune. It means need, and it is the N rune. This can be corroborated with other references in later literature. For example, you have the hero Sinfjotli from the same Volsunga saga I mentioned earlier, who is actually killed with such a horn, which had some kind of spell written in runes on it. Helping runes are also mentioned if you know how to assist and release children from women. It's quite unclear why Sigurd would have needed to know this spell, but it is included here. Also, the Disir are mentioned. They shall be cut on the palms and clubs on the joints, and then the Disir asks for help. So Disir, these ancestors, these female ancestors, and they were conflated with the entities of fate, the Nornir, in other sources such as Fafnismol. So it's generally speaking, a very long series of stanzas where Sigurdrifa explains how to write spells and what kind of spells. She also mentions the sea runes, so these you should use if you want to guarantee a safe passage on the sea. She also mentioned limb runes, and these are used in leechcraft. So if you want to be a healer and if you want to heal wounds. She also mentions speech runes, runes that should be used order to um, in order to be capable to lead a case in a court, for example. And she also mentions mind runes. So mind runes, if you want to be wiser minded than every man. And then there is a reference to Odin, here carrying the name Hropt. It's also a reference to other sources, Hroptatir, in another poem called Grimnismol, one of his many names. So Odin, Hropt, interpreted them, cut them, thought them out from that liquid which had leaked. Probable reference to the meat of poetry, quite unclear here. And then the two characters mentioned at the end of stanza 13, again very difficult to interpret, the bright dropper and the horde terror, or maybe they weren't characters after all, but some kind of metaphors. So as you can see here, she mentions quite a lot of runes, of strings of runes that can be used to different purposes, either to ensure victory in battle, or to help with childbirth, or to ensure your wit and wisdom, and so on and so forth. However, we don't find very concrete examples or evidence of these spells, so what the actual spells are. So this is just a reference to the fact that runic spells can be very powerful, and that a hero such as Sigurd really must be aware of how to use the different types of runes, the different types of strings, in order to become more powerful. And since we mentioned Odin, the second source you can use in order to highlight the importance of runes and the magic that can be performed with their help, you can find this reference in the poem called Hovamol. This is the second poem of the Poetic Edda, the Sayings of the High One, and it's the longest one. And it starts out as this very long series of stanzas dealing with the theme of wisdom, but then it has a second part which involves the spells, the many spells Odin knows, and it's very interesting how he got access to these spells, and that was performed during a sacrifice. So you see, he essentially sacrificed himself, and as a consequence of this ultimate absolute sacrifice, he learns the secrets of the runes, meaning how to cast spells. So in stanza 138, he says, "I know that I hung on a wind-swept tree 9 long nights, wounded with a spear dedicated to Odin, myself to myself, on that tree which no man knows from where its roots run," probably Yggdrasil. "And then I took up the runes, screaming I took them. Then I fell back from there. 9 mighty spells I learned from the famous son of Bolthor Bestla's father. That would be his uncle, actually. And I got a drink of the precious mead soaked from Odrerir. That would be the cauldron where the mead of poetry was kept. So here you can find the myth of how Odin got to possess this incredible knowledge of the spells. And then in the following stanzas, you're going to find 18 spells actually used to different purposes. So first of all, he mentions that the runes are these very meaningful letters, and then they were made by the huge powers and then used by the rune master with the help of the gods in order to cast a spell. And among the spells he mentions, for example, a spell that can be used to fetter furious enemies, to put bonds on men's limbs. He knows a spell that can be used in order to conjure evil. He knows a spell by which he can cast some fiery, yep, some towering flames to provoke damage at any rate. He also knows spells in order to attract women. He also knows spells that he can chant during battle, so battle magic, so that his representatives on the battlefield can come back safe. He knows spells that can bring back the dead so that he can speak to them and maybe tell him about what they have learned in the afterlife. He knows spells that can be used on swords as well. Again, empowerment spells. And generally speaking, all kinds of such strings of letters that can be used either to constructive or to destructive purposes. And the last stanza here is also quite interesting. Now the High One's song is recited in the High One's hall, very useful to the sons of men, quite useless to the sons of men. Luck to him who recited, luck to him who knows. May he benefit, he who learnt it, luck to those who listened. So this involves the paradoxical nature of spells. This is also something that is alluded to in the saga of Egil Skallagrimsson, for example. So the spells are definitely very useful if you really know how to use the runes. In other words, if you know how to spell correctly. And on the other hand, if you don't know how to use the runes, how to use the alphabet, you'd better refrain from it, because that could cause even more damage. But at any rate, there is this general idea that knowing how to write and knowing how to use these letters in order to perform sorcery was probably one of the greatest talents, or even the greatest talent that you could possibly achieve. Yeah, so speaking of Egil, the saga of Egil, we have a couple of very interesting examples here as well regarding runic law, or at least how runic magic was perceived in the later sources. The saga of Egil features several instances of runic magic, and this magic is performed by the Viking warrior poet skilled in these runes, who is Egil. So one example involves him encountering a piece of whale bone intended as a love charm, and then he criticizes the carver's incompetence, claiming that the secret staves he carved on it have caused the recipient harm instead of enchantment. So he then burns the bone and replaces it with a new runic message healing the afflicted girl. And then he utters this poem that no man should write runes unless he well knows how to interpret them. Many men are led astray by the dark stave. I saw in the shape whalebone 10 secret staves carved. These have caused the linden tree of the leek. Again, a very beautiful metaphor for a woman, long and great grief. There are several instances as well of him using the runes. Another instance is him identifying poison in a drinking horn meant for him by carving on it runes with his blood. And this act, accompanied by a verse he speaks, causes the horn to shatter, and then by this act, he neutralizes the threat. Yeah, you can see similar motifs in other examples from Norse literature, such as the poem The Second Lay of Gudrun, where you also have blood-reddened runes on a horn used to induce forgetfulness. This should be regarded, however, with a pinch of salt, because some of these references, for example, what he does with the horn, resemble some tales, like the tale of Saint Benedict from Pope Gregory's the Great. Pope Gregory the Great's dialogues, where the saint shatters a poisoned bottle with the sign of the cross. So this could indicate a potential contamination with some Christian motifs, of Christian sources. And then we also have the example where he curses King Eric Bloodaxe and his wife Gunhild by carving runes on a pole topped with a horse's head. This act is known as a ritual scorn, or nið in Old Norse, and it combines two types of nið described in Icelandic law, which is the verbal scorn and the wooden scorn. So essentially, you not only insult someone in a very bad way, in a very dangerous way, but you also write it down on this hazel pole in order to make this insult even more powerful. And you can see here there's also some kind of magical atmosphere going on by essentially using the pole in order to cast a form of hostile magic on your opponent. And there are other examples as well. In Grettir's saga, you have the foster mother of Thornbjorn, Thurid, who uses a piece of wood engraved with enchanted blood-reddened runes again, and she uses them to inflict physical harm upon Grettir, and actually that is successful because this is an act that indirectly contributes to his demise. But not all instances in later literature refer to this use of runes in a magical sense. In the same saga, in the saga of Grettir, you can also find a more realistic use of runes. For example, the act of writing poetry. So both the hero Grettir as well as a character called Hallmund engage in this practice. So in one instance, for example, Hallmund dictates a poem to his daughter, who then carves it onto a rune stick. And this is a practice that you can also find in the saga of Egil, where Egil's daughter Thorgerd similarly records the poem Sonatorek, the lament for my son, on a rune stick to help alleviate her father's grief over the loss of his son Bodvar. So you can notice here there is this antiquarian interest for the usage of runes, but both in a magical sense, that is perhaps the most common one, but there is also this memory of people using runes in order to write poems. And this is not only a memory, because if you look at the runic sticks from Bergen, they're written in a different type of alphabet, in medieval runes. So there were some changes here in the spelling, but definitely runes was still used in order to inscribe different messages. Further examples include the saga of the people of Svavardal. This features a runic inscription that causes a landslide. And while the inscription is described as dangerous, it's not really presented as inherently magical. Instead, the saga attributes it to a combination of this inscription placed on a loose rock and the actions of a vengeful characters who loosens the rocks. And this is an example that suggests that runes in later sources in the Icelandic sagas could be seen as instruments for enacting pre-existing intentions rather than really possessing autonomous magical power. In other words, they were used as a narrative device. And one more example would be the saga of Bossi and Heraud. This is a legendary saga. It is a later saga, so from the 15th century. And the story itself, it's very fantastic, but also very entertaining. And essentially, we're dealing here with an episode of a war breaking out between a king, Hring, and his son Heraud, one of the main characters of the saga. And Hring manages to capture Heraud and his friend Borsi, and he prepares to execute them, essentially. However, Borsi's foster mother, Busla, that night, known for her magical powers, she appears suddenly in the bedchamber of King Hring and harasses the king with a curse until the king agrees to make peace with both Heraud and Borsi, to the extent of sending them on a dangerous quest instead of executing them. And the most interesting part of this is that a specific phrase is used here in the saga of Borsi and Heraud, and that is the phrase with thistle mistletoe we had before. So the curse also found quite frequently on runic amulets. So, as a conclusion to this whole discussion about runic references, runic lore in more recent sources, while these can offer intriguing glimpses into potential historical usages of runes, their account should always be interpreted with a degree of caution, because they're literary creations and sagas often prioritize the dramatic effect and entertainment value, which of course can lead to exaggerations and distortions of actual runic practices and beliefs. If we do look at poems that are written later but are of earlier date, such as the aforementioned Hovamol and Sigurdrivumol, we do have references that may corroborate the whole usages on the amulets and on the rune stones. So indeed, we do have healing spells, we have empowerment spells, and we also have cursing spells. So this is definitely a very interesting aspect to look out for when studying runic inscriptions. There would have been quite a lot of magical use, but on the other hand, to reiterate the idea from the beginning, the main attention when engaging in such inscriptions was a little more commonplace. So we should regard these magical usages not as the rule. And of course, that doesn't mean that the mundane inscriptions dealing with either messages or commemorative practices and so on and so forth were less important. Quite the contrary. So knowing how to spell, knowing how to write was definitely a great talent. It was probably an even greater talent if you lived, say, in the 400s or in the 500s, and that is why from this time of the elder Futhark, you have inscriptions which are either very short or very obscure. So it would have been definitely a great skill to possess, and thus this whole magical atmosphere created around them. And in the Viking Age, we have the younger Futhark, and most runestones, for example, that we have, about 3,000, they actually don't have anything magical in them. They are just these rune stones used to not only to commemorate people who died, but also to comment on the kinship relationships, on the social relationships from a particular area and a particular time. So they're definitely either magical or non-magical. They're definitely a glimpse into the world of, let's say, roughly speaking, Germanic peoples until the Viking Age. So for that, they should really be appreciated, either magical or not. So thank you very much. That was the last installment of the series. I may return with another video, perhaps on some kind of particular example, such as the Rök runestone that was not discussed here. The Rök runestone being the longest inscription on a runestone, and it's a very cryptic one, a very problematic one. So maybe I'll do a video about that. But until then, I hope you enjoy these three so to speak, lessons about the usages of runes in sorceress contexts in the Viking Age and before the Viking Age. So, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you again, Irina, for a wonderfully in-depth presentation. There are 2 other iterations of this that are saved on our YouTube channel and Irina's YouTube channel, our Facebook, etc. So if you missed the first 2 sessions, please go check them out there. Irina will be back with us at the end of October for our Halloween bash, so look out for the announcements about that. Yeah, Irina, as always, this was wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us again. And we're looking forward to next time in about a month.
Yep, looking forward to it as well. Thank you so much. And I hope this was useful and informative to you.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for watching. We'll see you next time.